Sir, you are in live. Good to go.
Okay. Good evening, one and all, and welcome to this interesting session on the complications managing a complicated case of vitreoretinal surgery. We have amongst us the esteemed faculty from across the nation, Dr. Dhananjay Shukla, who is from Gwalior Ratan Jyoti Netralay, Dr. Vinod Agarwal from RP Center, New Delhi, Dr. Raja Narayan from LV Prasad, Hyderabad, Dr. Saravanan from Arvind Coimbatore, and Dr. Ashray. Myself, Dr. Jatinder, I'll be moderating the session. And without wasting further time, let's start with the Dr. Ashray, who will be speaking on management of combined mechanism retinal detachment and how he does it and what are the various challenges that he faces. Over to you, Dr. Ashray.
Thank you, sir. So I'll be sharing my screen. Is it visible, sir? Today is my presentation on vitrectomy for diabetic combined retinal detachments. I welcome one and all, and I have no financial disclosures. Combined mechanism already has two components. One is the tractional component, and another one is a rhegmatogenous component. So it usually has a convex or a bullous configuration because of the liquefied vitreous, which moves through a full thickness retinal break into the subretinal space. So pre-op planning for better outcomes includes controlling systemic diabetes. Stopping antiplatelets is not necessary in all cases. Use of preoperative anti-VEGF and choosing the appropriate surgical platform and proficiency in bimanual technique contributes to the success of the surgery. We use preoperative anti-VEGF drugs only if we notice a large active neovascular fronts, and they are given after the patient has obtained medical clearance for the surgery. We refrain from using them if there are more of a fibrous component than a neovascular component to the detachment. We prefer to do the injection 3 to 5 days before the surgery. A good surgical view is crucial for these complex cases, given that close pilling to the retina is necessary. So we have a very low threshold for cataract surgery prior to vitrectomy. We request our cataract surgeons to make a large capsular excis, place a 3-piece intraocular lens in the back to ensure stability with any tamponade, and do a thorough posterior capsular polish and essentially place a suture at the main wound. So coming to the techniques, these techniques include segmentation delamination, lift and shape, modified en bloc, and divide and conquer techniques. All the techniques begin with careful dissection of posterior hyaloid membrane. The first step in any case should be to trim and release the core vitreous from the peripheral vitreous, which is usually done at mid-periphery or wherever there is maximal separation between the vitreous and the underlying retina, using the highest cutter rate and the least amount of suction possible. And the cutter port should always face the vitreous while the cone is being trimmed. In cases of simple diabetic detachments, segmentation can be done with vitreous cutter alone. Segmentation is cutting the fibrotic epiretinal membranes into small segments, and delamination involves removal of these segments from the surface of the retina. These elements can be then removed with a vitreous cutter, preferably which has a port optimization using high cut rate and minimal suction under high magnification. The unipolar cautery probe tip can be useful to dissect fine adhesions of the membranes and also in obtaining immediate hemostasis of the bleeders. Once dissection is done, completion of the membrane removal can be done with the cutter. Lift and shave technique is possible because of the newer advances in 27 and 25 gauge vitrectomy probes. These probes can have usually have port optimization with optimized fluidics and high cutting. This technique exploits the port optimization to separate the membranes, bluntly dissect, shave, and do carpet rolling of the membranes in diabetic vitrectomy, allowing it to have an efficient removal of tractional tissue from ischemic and detached retina. Another technique is modified en bloc resection. This is done either using ILM forceps or PICS forceps to elevate the membrane with minimal iatrogenic damage. Removal of the entire posterior hyaloid is done using a cutter with port inserted in the space between the membrane and the retina, and all the adhesions are cut with the port facing away from the retina. The dual dynamic drive mode in Constellation platform gives adequate control to execute this step safely. You can see once adhesions are realized, we are able to remove the membrane in one large piece without any iatrogenic breaks. In many cases where the adhesion is too dense, bimanual technique can be very effective. For the membranes that are not amenable for unimanual dissection, bimanual dissection technique is used. Here we place a small chandelier and use ILM in non-dominant hand and a curved scissors in the dominant hand to carefully dissect without causing any iatrogenic breaks. This is particularly useful in areas where there are neovascular fronts with densely adherent membranes to the retinal tissue. Bimanual technique is also useful in cases of peripheral traction, especially in phakic patients. Vitreous cutter is unsafe due to compromised stereoscopic view in the periphery. This technique gives better control to resect the membrane from anterior to posterior, and membranes can be removed in one large piece without any collateral damage. ILM peeling is useful technique to make sure that macula is absolutely free of any tractional forces. I use a pinch release peel approach with ILM to initiate ILM peeling after using brilliant blue dye under air to get good staining, which helps in better visualization of ILM with high magnification. Due to lower counter traction, care should be taken to avoid any iatrogenic damage to the macula. Curvature of the posterior pole should be constantly kept in the mind as well. Sometimes these detachments are associated with subretinal bands. These subretinal bands can be removed after creating a retinotomy. Anterior to these bands, the subretinal band can be easily visualized using the light pipe directly over the retinotomy, and the subretinal band can be removed using max grip forceps. In another case with densely adherent membrane with questionable anatomy, we use divide and conquer technique. This is simply dividing the membrane into smaller and smaller pieces. It is especially useful in cases such as this, where in a typical retinal anatomy is not identified. We have actually divided the membrane into half and kind of follow wherever the tissue takes us, and then we proceed to further divide the membrane into smaller and smaller pieces until the retinal anatomy can be identified and the membranes can be removed. Proper identification of surgical planes helps to have minimal intraoperative bleeding, which can be easily be managed by raising the IOP in the range of 60 to 80 mm of mercury and with prompt and immediate cautery of bleeders. We continue to divide the membrane into smaller and smaller pieces till the complete removal of all tractional membranes from the retina. Subretinal blood can be evacuated with extrusion or cutter, which is necessary to facilitate for successful reattachment of retina. The areas where traction cannot be relieved completely, focal retinectomy can be done after adequate marking with diathermy. Focal retinectomy can be useful in making these areas absolutely free from any traction. Fluid air exchange is done which is followed by pan-retinal photocoagulation, which is meticulously done to as much periphery as possible. I invariably use silicone oil injection, which is promptly removed after 3 months. These are the few of the postoperative outcomes achieved after the surgery done using combination of these techniques. All these surgeries are associated with complications, which can be classified as early or late. Early can be intraoperative hemorrhage, retinal breaks, or lens damage in phakic patients. And late can be retinal detachments with PVR, neovascular glaucoma, and in failed cases, it can progress to phthisis bulbi. So if the most common complication is post-vitrectomy bleeding, which can be managed either by observation with sugar monitoring or by vitreous lavage or by injecting an anti-VEGF injection, or in few cases, repeat vitrectomy for exploration and re-delamination and diathermy and laser is required. Patience and persistence are required for meticulous removal of fibrovascular membranes. The ultimate goal is to relieve all tractional forces from the retina using any technique or combination of multiple techniques. Finally, while considering and discussing with the patient any potential surgery, it is important to convey the realistic goals, expected outcomes, including multiple interventions and risk of complications. I would like to thank my patients, our team at Eye Foundation, and my mentor, Dr. Raja, who has taught me of these surgeries. Thank you.
Excellent presentation, Ashray. We have like discussion minutes of time of 8 minutes. There are a few questions. I would like to start with a few questions first. How often and do you use encerclage in cases of managing like combined detachments?
Sir, very rarely I've used encerclage, but in one of the cases, there was a focal traction where I had to do a focal retinectomy somewhere in the mid-periphery. So this peripheral detachments, if the combined detachment has a fibrovascular component in the mid-periphery, in those cases, the stereoscopic view is also very less in the periphery. Dissection is very difficult in the periphery. That time we'll have to do a focal retinectomy. In those cases, I've used encerclage, but otherwise, generally without encerclage, most cases can be managed.
Okay, and how do you choose to use chandeliers in a complicated case? Like most of the times, many of the times actually you have a very clear plane and you're able to dissect just with the cutter. But there are times when you have very tough attachments, broad, flat attachments, and it's difficult. And when you use bimanual technique, you may need to like switch chandelier. So how do you choose to place the chandelier? Where do you start?
Sir, by thumb rule, we usually place the chandelier in the area in the quadrant of opposite to the quadrant of dissection. But if you need extensive dissection, you can use two chandeliers to avoid shadows and to get maximum illumination. So two chandeliers can be handy in these cases.
Okay. And what about resurgeries? Like when do you actually see a case and judge that this is not worth operating, or like when do you give up on a case of combined detachment?
Intraoperatively, sir, one is if there is a macular break, then there is no point proceeding or putting so much effort to salvage it. But if there is any large break which is coupled with a lot of fibrous component, I have abandoned those cases. Otherwise, these cases with a lot of patients can be salvaged to a certain level.
Okay, and there are times when we have to reoperate after the first surgery. We encounter a lot of bleeding, and we have to say abandon for the time being, and then we take up the case second time. And what are the things that you look for at that time, and what are the complications that you expect the second time?
Sir, post intraoperative bleeding, there is actually this blood which has oozed becomes very adherent to the retina. So we usually give an anti-VEGF before taking for the second surgery. But if we are not able to identify the plane in second surgery, then I usually abandon the case and close the case under air. I will not put oil in a detached retina. That is the basic rule I always follow.
Okay, and any choice of oil, whether do you choose to give like 5,000 centistrokes, or do you use the usual 1,500 centistrokes oil?
Because once if I'm very sure that I've removed all the traction, I use oil, sir. So my choice has always been 1,500 centistrokes. I've never used 5,000 in these cases.
Okay, Dr. Shukla, do you have anything to add to Ashray's presentation? I mean, the things which he has discussed.
Yeah, I have a few things. Do we have time for that?
We have 2 minutes.
The first thing is the optimum time to take a patient after a pre-operative anti-VEGF is not 3 to 4 or 5 days, as we previously believed. It is actually about 10 days. This was decided on a randomized trial. I think we discussed on DRF actually. And because a lot of people have concept that in 10 days, the retina will become completely atrophic or ischemic or something, it does not happen like that. So I take my case after 7 to 10 days after anti-VEGF. That's point number one. Second thing you asked about what else, in a bad case, what else do you do? So I use PFCL as an intermediate tamponade in some of the complex cases when I'm not able to attach the retina 360 degrees. Some of these cases, when I believe there is a visual potential. Since most of the combined attachments are posterior pathology, generally like diabetes or vein occlusions or BRV or something like that, and rarely vasculitis. So these cases, you can see the look for retinal ischemia and how chronic it is. So, and also you can do an OCT if the media is visible to look for the the status of the retina. So whether Mueller cells are present or not, or whether they are a very atrophic appearance of retina. So those cases are not worth taking in a pre-operative assessment. That's it.
Thank you, sir, for the valuable inputs. And there's one more question which has come: whether do you use the disc pallor as a guide to abandon a case? I think the answer is no.
Correct.
Disc pallor is not a good indicator of the ischemic status. How atrophic the retina is may not be actually visible on the disc. Sometimes you can have very pale disc and a very like nicely functioning retina. So we'll switch to the second topic. Dr. Shukla will be presenting on occult optic disc pit. Please pose your questions on the chat box if you have any. Thank you, Dr. Shukla.
So are my slides visible?
Yes, sir. Good to go, sir.
It's on full screen now.
Yes, sir.
And am I audible?
Clear, sir.
All right. So Jitendra has given me a kind of standout kind of topic, occult optic disc maculopathy, in the sense that this is outside the purview of the the surgical topic which other people have. And since it is the occult part which is most interesting here, I will try to make the occult part overt for the audience rather than detailing about the surgery, which is a complete different talk in itself. So first, the basic information. What is an optic pit actually? Optic pit is a congenital coloboma of the optic nerve, but it's an atypical coloboma. So why it is atypical? The typical colobomas occur at the site of the embryonic fissure that is inferonasal. So you can see in the picture here, I put an arrow. So this is a typical coloboma in the picture below. And when you have, sometimes you have a typical and atypical coloboma in the same disc. So that's a very interesting thing which I'll go to talk about sometime. And when you have this, you have to differentiate a typical coloboma from a open angle glaucoma. Now I'll show you some interesting pictures where you have optic pit with the typical coloboma and optic pit with open angle glaucoma. But here, how to differentiate? So differentiate by the size of the disc itself. In a colobomatous disc, the disc itself is much enlarged, unlike a glaucomatous disc where the disc size is normal. So compare it to the phalloids, a simple answer. So pits can occur anywhere on the optic nerve, but they are most notorious when they are on the temporal side, because they are the ones which cause almost all of the maculopathy. You can have a disc on the nasal side, superior, inferior, or central, but they generally do not cause maculopathy as commonly as the temporal disc. Now, what is the maculopathy? What happens to the macula? So previously, when I was in Arvind actually, and I was a fellow, we used to call it a CSR. We used to call it optic pit with CSAR. That means any CS detachment, we used to think of it as a central serous retinopathy, not chorioretinopathy, central serous retinopathy. It was Linkoff, the genius of Linkoff, who without the help of OCT first told us that maculopathy is not a detachment, it's a schisis. And that means the fluid starts to come into the macular retina from the disc through the retinal layers first. The subretinal fluid develops only later, and it worsens the prognosis. Whereas the intraretinal fluid may remain stable and may not disturb the vision at all. Now, before talking about the occult pit, let's look at the pit itself. The pit itself is pretty subtle to diagnose. So, while looking for a review article on secondary macular holes, I came across a very funny report in Eye. I've written in 2012, idiopathic macular hole in a child. So I had never heard about it. A child has no business of having an idiopathic macular hole. So I thought, what is this? So when I look at the report, I could immediately see that these guys had misdiagnosed in a published report, mind you, and clearly visible optic, but you can see in the arrow, and a macular schisis as an idiopathic macular hole. In fact, the authors themselves would cause a macular hole while doing a surgery. So this is, even the pit is subtle itself, but it is visible if you look for it. So one thing is, you have to know that there's something called pit, and if you have a macular schisis, you should look for it. In fact, there's a large series of articles, about 60 cases published in Retina last year from Israeli group, including my friend Anatole Lowenstein. So they said that the diagnosis was missed in 3/4 of the cases. And in fact, a lot of these patients are actually 50-year or older. So even the younger patients, they diagnose these cases as either CNVM or when old as AMD. So their commonest misdiagnosis was CNVM, believe it or not. Imagine a case of macular schisis with it being called a case of CNVM. It looks, you feel like enraged actually. And not only that, 95% of them had already received anti-VEGF injections prior to being referred to this group for further intervention. So I used to wonder at this when I came to Ratan Jyoti Netralaya Gwalior. I saw a young intern, mind you, a medical intern, say 26-year-old, who was misdiagnosed as a case of CNVM while he had this kind of picture. You can see that there's a subtle pit. You can see there's an area of atrophy here, and you can see that you may not be able to see, but there is a schisis and serous elevation kind of picture here. So OCT clearly showed that this is a schisis with, in fact, a lot of thinning on the central area. But this patient had this kind of funny appearance in the center, which probably made the previous surgeon, mind you, he was a senior surgeon in Gwalior and a very respected ophthalmologist, retina specialist. So he did a fluorescein angiography. So probably he thought of it as a CSCR. When he did a fluorescein angiography, he saw this picture. And mind you, he ignored this pit, which is seen here in the arrow, but he looked at this hyperfluorescence and he thought it is CSCR. Looking at this, and went and thought of it as a post CSCR CNVM and gave an anti-VEGF injection. So, a very simple thing to differentiate is just look at the later phase. If you look at the later phase, you can see that all these are actually window defects. 1, 2, 3. All the 3 cases of hyperfluorescence are window defects. If you have autofluorescence, you can as well confirm it that even the central part and the peripheral part, this is all actually atrophic RPE. But even without that, if you can read fluorescein angiography normally, you can see that this is window defect and not a CNVM. Now, pit is already subtle, and when you have an occult pit, it adds to the diagnostic challenge. In fact, when I read the first report by Spade in Retina 2003, it burnt my heart. Now, you won't believe it, but at least about 18 years back, I had seen my first case of occult optic pit, which I thought was occult optic pit. But while I was in the dilemma of whether to submit for publication, he submitted it and published it. So the first report belongs to Rick Spade. It's a 29-year-old Indian man, by the way. It was lasered for CSCR. Look at this picture with no leak, in spite of having no leak. So according to Spade, the syncretic vitreous entered into the retina through the fenestrated membrane on the optic nerve head. So he did not call it an occult optic pit. He simply said that it's a case of macular schisis without optic pit. But he did agree that it was a mechanism similar to that of the pit. He said there's a membrane on the disc which was partly fenestrated, and because of the movements of the eye with the heartbeats, it pumped fluid into the retina through that. So now this is how it started. Now, in my cases, I find it's not the CNVM, but central serous chorioretinopathy is the most obvious differential diagnosis, simply because what you see in many of these cases is simply a serous detachment. Now, it may look like a fresh serous detachment, as in the picture on the top, or a recurrent detachment because of the subretinal precipitates, and a picture like this. But it does not definitely look like a chronic CSCR, which we all know how it looks like with a lot of RP defects and diffuse RP decompensation. However, if it is a fresh CSCR, it should have a very definite OCT. So OCT is the diagnostic of optic pit in most of these cases. Also, the fluorescein angiography does not show any definite leak like that of a fresh CSCR. It can show a leak which is similar to a chronic CSCR, but mind you, the picture is not that of a chronic CSCR. Chronic CSCR looks like this. Now, paradoxically, in these cases, you get an OCT which is similar to the schisis of a pit. Now, if you have a schisis like this in a pit, even if you are diagnosed it as a case of optic pit, you should not operate it because it already has suffered enough damage, and probably there will be no news of surgery. In fact, the fellow eye shows a clear-cut shallow detachment in PED and confirms the diagnosis of a chronic CSCR. Chronic CME can similarly, when it is long-standing, can cause atrophy of the Mueller cells, and therefore you can see that the Mueller cells have lost their vertical strings, and this retina becomes more or less dead. It is like a cystic degeneration and no longer a cystoid edema. So it's not worth treating. So the first case that I recorded after the initial shock of Spades was in 2009, and this is a lady called Mala who had a unilateral visual drop. This was I saw it in Arvind with a vision of 6 by 36. The fluorescein angiography showed this kind of fuzzy leak, because of which she underwent transpupillary thermotherapy by another colleague of mine. We are a big hospital at Arvind for suspected leaks. Obviously, this detachment, which are because of schisis, did not respond to that, and I was not conversant with the surgery in this cases, so we just left that case as that. After that, I've collected about a dozen cases of occult optic pits. So typically, you expect this patient to be young, but my range is 13 to 65 years. In fact, most of the patients, 10 out of 12 patients, are more than 40 years. They are more males than females, and the average age is actually 49 years in my series. The fundus looks most like CSCR in my series. Remember in Annette Lowenstein series, it was looking like a CNVM or an AMD. Half the cases look normal. I mean, they have a normal macula. As you can see in this picture, the macula looks normal. So you may ask, how did the case come to me? It came accidentally, or because it was seen by somebody, or OCT was done for some other reason, for glaucoma. So one case was a suspected glaucoma. Now, this is not that case, but the enhanced depth OCT or even a regular OCT can show you two things. One, the schisis, which is there in the retina, in the macula, is more prominent on the nasal side, and it is communicating with the optic nerve. And second thing, you can always see a pit in most of the eyes. So you can see that there's a very deep and vertically triangular kind of pit in these cases. Fluorescein angiography people unnecessarily do because of thinking it as a CSCR or a CNVM. Otherwise, there's no use of fluorescein angiography, though I agree that in some cases, you can see a pit as a hyperfluorescent dot like this. And you can also do it to differentiate from CSCR leak, but of course, not from a chronic CSCR. So one case had undergone a transpupillary thermotherapy, 3 cases underwent vitrectomy, and 1 went a trap for open angle glaucoma in my series. So we have looked at CNVM AMD, we have looked at acute recurrence of chronic CSCR, and we have looked at chronic CME. We have not looked at it, but this looks very similar. So any chronic CME, because of on its own or because of VRM or VMT, can later on progress into a schisis, which can look like this. It is very easy to differentiate. So the other differentiating difficulty which I see in my practice is myopic foveal schisis. In fact, you can have a non-myopic foveal schisis also, which Jitendra enlightened me can have a specific term called sniffer. I'll tell about that later. In X-linked retinoschisis, you can have an open-angle glaucoma with schisis and an acquired pit. And most interestingly, you can have a hybrid coloboma. So what about high myopia? The high myopia is going to be one of the commonest cause of foveal schisis that we'll see in the coming years, at least in Asian countries, because we have an epidemic of high myopia here. So in this, mind you, this even though if you look at the serous elevation, it looks adjoining to the disc, but you can see that it is actually centered on the fovea. So the main pathology in the fovea itself or the macula itself, the foveal schisis, it is more subtle, not as prominent as the pit schisis, and because it does not have that much fluid coming as from the abnormal disc tissue, and there's a background of high myopia. Sometimes it is so subtle that you cannot see clinically any schisis, where it is very clearly seen on an OCT. So you can differentiate from a high myopia by the myopia itself, by the foveal nature of the schisis at the centers in the center of the fovea, and it is more subtle as compared to that pit schisis. Now, what about X-linked retinoschisis? If you look at classic retinoschisis, the commonest cause is X-linked. The one thing that is X-linked, that is seen only in males. Second thing, it is central. So the most prominent cysts are there in the center mostly. So even though splitting is present in the entire retina and sometimes in the nasal retina as well, but most prominent splitting is in the center, and it is most commonly bilateral. So you can have a peripheral schisis also, and therefore you can easily differentiate it from the optic pit schisis. Now coming to what Jitendra told me about. Now it's a very funny term, stellate, non-hereditary, idiopathic foveo-macular retinoschisis. Very funny term to say that is just a non-myopic schisis. So Mike Obear, a guy who from US, New York, who came to India to Arvind also, he collected 17 cases from 5 institutions, of which mostly they were females. In fact, the majority of them are myopic. This is interesting. So they had a picture which looked definitely like X-linked retinoschisis, but they ruled out X-linked retinoschisis by genetic testing in all of them, even though most were females. They saw macular splitting in all the eyes, mostly in the outer plexiform layer, as you can see here, and 2 of the eyes also had a peripheral schisis. So there was no PVD in most of the cases. Most were unilateral, just like optic pit maculopathy, but it looks very different if you look at it again because it was centered on the macula and the vision was preserved in most of the cases, unlike what happens in optic pit maculopathy. Except, now note this, when the subretinal fluid intervened. So here also the devil or the culprit was subretinal fluid. Now what about open angle glaucoma? Open angle glaucoma is known to have acquired pits along with it actually, and sometimes it is known to cause a peripapillary subtle schisis. But when you see a case of 90% cupping like this in both eyes, only one eye, now this eye has a normal macula, this eye has a macula like this, then it is definitely not because of the acquired pits, which are more common, by the way, on the vertical pole, superiorly and inferiorly, not so much in the temporal part. And they are very small, they do not cause any fluid leakage. If you have such a massive leakage, it has to be an occult pit, which is somewhere in this substance here of the open angle glaucoma. Now let me come to my favorite hybrid coloboma actually. So I have seen about 7 cases of typical and atypical coloboma. Atypical coloboma means optic pit combined. So when you have a coloboma like this, how can we show that you have an additional atypical coloboma or pit in the eye? You can see that here, I will say, and you have more detachment in the area of pit. And more importantly, the typical coloboma detachments are regular RRDs or rhegmatogenous retinal detachments, but these are the detachment that you see in the case of optic pit. So this cases generally harbor an optic pit within them, and therefore I include it in the classification of occult pit. The prognosis is worse because of the coloboma with pit combining to cause a bigger detachment. There may be an associated inferior detachment. They may require more extensive laser or maybe an oil tamponade, and they will not generally settle without vitrectomy. So having said that, my experience was okay with this series. This is a young lady with bilateral coloboma. You can see that the coloboma itself does not cause any detachment in the right eye, whereas with the left eye with the pit, it caused a classic schisis, and inferiorly, the schisis has a detachment, but this is not an RRD. There was no break in this patient. I did not trim the peripheral vitreous and all. So I did the regular vitrectomy, which I do for the optic pits. I did a more extensive barrage in the lower part because of the fear of this. Now, this peripheral detachment settled quickly, but the nasal detachment took a long time to settle. In fact, it was quite detached. If you compare the previous picture, this was, sorry. So this was quite detached, but the vision was 636. It has improved. So I just observed it after a month. And at the last follow for 26 months, she had improved tremendously from 1/60 to 618 with nearly normal appearing fovea. So, which is almost unimaginable in a patient like this with a heavy laser inferiorly, and you can see this 26-month follow. So, this is about the schisis. So, we are retrospectively suspecting an occult pit in a patient when there is a schisis. When the schisis has certain features like where it is more prominent on the nasal side, there is a communication with the optic pit or optic pit-like structure. But can we diagnose a pit without a schisis? Now it is just an intellectual exercise, and it can be an accidental OCT diagnosis in a case of glaucoma. But you can only suspect it and not diagnose it. And anyway, there is no point in diagnosing because you're not going to treat or do anything about it. So, but how do you differentiate a deep cup from a central pit? There is no literature on that, but my assessment is it is actually almost like bottomless, very deep. It is triangular, not like the glaucomatous cupping, which is generally U-shaped or oval. Coming to the last part of the lecture, pit may not be the only problem. Now you have seen a pit which is not occult, clinically obvious. You have seen on OCT a schisis, which is again typical. So will you go and operate this case? No. I saw this case posted for my surgery when I was in Arvind, but clinically it looked like an RRD or a very funny kind of corrugations on the retina. So I was not comfortable with this case. Actually, I was not sure what it was. Secondly, this patient was 57-year-old man. In spite of that, he did not have any RP atrophy. He had only 10 days history, mind you. 10 days history, even though he was 57-year-old. The pit and the OCT matched, but the vision was hand motion. So I could not explain the vision. He also had an RAPD. The subretinal fluid was not typical of the pit, which is the main reason why I suspected something else. And so I asked for a B scan. And lo and behold, when I did a B scan, I found that there was an arachnoid cyst of the optic nerve. So we got it confirmed by a CT scan. It was sent to the orbit department for optic nerve decompression and cyst excision, which settled the case. So clinical examination trumps even OCT for diagnosis of suspects. So before telling anything about treatment, I'm not going to tell much about treatment because treatment is same as for regular pits. I would say when not to treat. When the vision is good, the duration does not matter because these patients have fluctuations in their vision for a very long time before the fluid sets in. So we should only follow them up with serial OCT scans, look for the increasing size of macular schisis, look if there's schisis in multiple layers, if there's an interruption of the ellipsoid zone, or if most importantly, if there is subretinal fluid, which is when you decide to operate. The vision may not correlate with the schisis, which is another reason not to operate. When there is a gross RP degeneration, again, as I told you, when the schisis is hollowing out into full thickness cyst, as you see on the left on this picture. So this patient has bilateral pits, but both are left alone. In the right eye, the vision is too poor, and there's a gross RP degeneration, as you can see in the clinical picture. And OCT confirmed that the retina is completely dead, so you don't do anything. In the left eye, you can see that in spite of the pit, the schisis is only intraretinal and extending only on the nasal part of the papillomacular bundle with macula intact, with a vision of 6 parts. So both eyes don't need treatment. In the management, the first thing is first do no harm. The natural history is not bad if the vision is good at presentation, which is retained in 3/4 of the cases. When there is no no subretinal fluid, that is only intraretinal fluid. When the patient is young because they have a healthy retina and RP, and that is, by the way, the reason why we don't treat CSCR. And we should follow them up with the visual acuity, OCT, and autofluorescence. The definitive treatment is only vitrectomy. There's a recent review of 26 studies with about 350 cases by Zheng et al. In ophthalmology retina, which confirms what we already know from many previous large-scale studies, that vitrectomy with PVD induction is the key step, and all other steps are necessary only in complex cases or if the primary surgery fails. So label is surgery failure only after a year or so, because the pit with schisis keeps on improving for at least that much time. Thank you very much.
So excellent talk, sir. Master stroke, very well presented. I think nobody needs to go to the literature and now read about occult pit. So I have a couple of questions. As the questions are pouring
Yeah,
in
give me a
chat
second.
box.
Let me. Yes, Jitendra.
Yes. So as in glaucoma, we see the entity which is also described by some authors as deep cup maculopathy. Is there anything different? Do you take any precautions pre-op or intra-op while operating on such cases?
Now, this is a question I actually cannot answer, because the only case with 90% cups in my series is the one I did not operate. So, but if I had to answer intuitively, I would say yes. The main thing to see is that they should not have a severe pressurized. Most of these cases have about 90% cupping. So be careful. You may have a slightly underfill of, you may not have a gas fill for a long time. You don't need gas fill. Some people need, do not relieve air or nothing at all. So do not fill the eye with a long-standing gas, at least in these cases. That's the only precaution I would say.
So I also think that we can probably do pre-op fields in case the scotoma involves the fixation. Maybe in those cases, the chances of snuff out is high, and the post-op vision loss can be also.
I would go to glaucoma clinic evaluation and let him decide. Actually, yes, you're absolutely right. The snuff out is the thing we are looking for. Yes.
So on OCT, do you look for any membrane over the pit? Something what people call as Doyle's membrane. Do you feel that it is more common in pit cases?
Yeah.
And there is membrane, there is pit maculopathy is more common. Is it?
Yeah, that's a good question actually, but it's a good theoretical question, because it does not matter to my mind actually. So if you look at the first report of Spade, he said that there is a fenestrated membrane in the disc. And if you look at the glaucoma cases, they also say that they have fenestrated cups. They say sometimes they have multiple occult pits. Having said that, I do not see any logic to have a. See, people also say that if there is a membrane, you have to remove it. Some people have said that there's a membrane. If you don't remove that membrane, you do not succeed in surgery. And there's another group of people who say that you should stuff the pit with the plug actually, so that because if the pit is open, then it will keep transporting fluid. So yes, membrane may be present. It is present in some cases, but I would prefer to ignore it actually. If I induce a PVD and in some cases do an alum peeling, I do not do further. I ignore the membrane.
So one more question. Do you feel that is there any role of any other imaging short of angiography to diagnose pits? I mean, if there is an occult pit, do you think infrared imaging or any other tool imaging tool helps in diagnosing?
Yeah, now that's again a very good question. You are prompting me by saying infrared imaging. Yes. So actually, I wanted to show images in various ways. I was when I used to see this pit, I was struggling to see the pit somehow. So as you said, you should hit the patient with everything you have. Do an FFA. Sometimes on FFA you can see an hypofluorescent spot, but not in all the cases. By all means, do a red filter photography. It's cheap and zero expense. And in some kinds, because it shows the deeper level, sometimes you can see a hypofluorescent or a dark area in that. Actually, I have seen that. I don't have it in this presentation, but that is seen in some of the pits. So you can diagnose a pit by that. If you have a swept source OCT, I don't have, that can better delineate a subtle pit actually, and in fact show you the depth of the pit, which is very important to see. So one a good use of swept source OCT can be to show the great vertical depth of the pit which you see in these cases, which is not seen in a typical glaucoma or even other pit, actually, normal cupping. Yes, so
thank you so much. I think I will have to admit that the topic of sniffer was given by the idea was given by Vinod. He is the one who actually shared that thing, and it happened that I shared it with you.
Can I ask a question?
Vinod, yeah, Vinod, please.
Yes, Vinod. Yes, please.
Excellent talk, sir. So
thank you.
Also don't see any case of any abnormal finding in your disc, which you are referring to as occult disc, occult pit. and this sniffer entity, can they be the same thing? Because they also did not find any abnormality on the optic disc clinically.
Yeah, so that's a very good question first. Yes. So your question is whether occult pit can be a sniffer actually. So
Are we referring the same
assessment-
entity by two different names? What I mean to say.
yes, exactly, exactly.
Yes.
So I would say no. I would reluctantly say no. Actually, there is one more article I would like everybody to read. It's an article on Diagnostic Authorities on optic pit. It is Mark Johnson actually, or Thompson, Mark Thompson. So he has assessed a case of high myopia with glaucoma with a maculoschisis, and he has said very authoritatively that why it is a disc, it is a disc pit, and because of a cavitary abnormality in the disc. Now I am very specific. Call it pit or call it a cavitary abnormality. But he said there is the fluid in this case is coming from the disc. So in the cases of a sniffer, the fluid is very clearly not coming from the disc because the area of schisis is more prominent in the center and not in the nasal papillomacular bundle.
Oh.
So that is my main differentiating point from the occult pit. And this is what most of the authors also say.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
This is
Thank
a
you.
very important point. Again, Dr. Shukla, nice presentation and a good question. That even if you have one case and you may have seen at one point you can have a confusion or a doubt, but if you have seen in a group of patients and you have followed them up and you always see that the center is more involved with the schisis than the nasal part,
Right, right.
to the fovea, then it is, I mean, almost you can say that it's not that, one off
Right.
you can still, assume things. But then, yes, the other thing is that I just wanted to point out because a lot of people misdiagnose. It was very well brought out as CSR, CNVM. In a young patient, 12-year-old, 15-year-old, if you see, please don't diagnose CSR. I mean, you can consider causes
Exactly.
that are not the normal causes. So you can consider optic disc pit as, one of the reasons. Look for it. And whenever you see the inverted mushroom that is in the center of the fovea, you will see that it is a mushroom shape. So it's not a hole, it's appearing, it's going to become a hole, but it's covered and it's a mushroom shape. That's also a pointer. And then the nasal side more showing fluid, whether it is subretinal or intraretinal. These are the pointers which we should
Great.
look.
Thanks.
Inject silicone oil in these cases because retrograde transmission to the brain. Optic chiasma has been demonstrated. In fact, patient comes with one eye loss of vision. So you injected oil, give prone position, it floats up, goes to the optic chiasma. Patient complains of other eye field defects.
My God.
That has, optic chiasma, almost 2-3 ml of oil has been shown. Neurosurgeons have had to remove silicone oil after doing brain surgery.
My God.
So don't inject silicone oil in these cases.
Great pointer. Yeah, yeah. So in the coloboma with pit, I'll remember that. Right. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. We'll go to Dr. Raja Narayan now. He will be talking on one more indication of entering into the vitreous cavity while doing buckle, chandelier assisted scleral buckling. Over to Dr. Raja.
Yeah, I hope you can see my slide, and or it's basically a video that I'm going to show. I don't have any PowerPoint here, but again, thanks to Jatinder and Ashray for inviting me for this talk. I mean, this is not a major thing. It's not my innovation or anything, but I feel that it's an important teaching tool. Now, teaching can happen when the senior faculty is operating and the fellow is seeing, or even better when the fellow is operating and the senior has to guide the fellow. That's an even better way of teaching, and this is where scleral buckle with chandelier can be an additional advantage. Is absolutely teaching. Nobody can claim that chandelier assisted buckle will have more reattachment rates or the vision is better or the complications are less. No, but we all claim that buckles are being done less often. It's a dying art. If you ask some fellow, they'll say, I never did a buckle in my fellowship. So these are the points to be considered when you look at scleral buckling with chandelier assisted. This is just to show that nowadays we have other technologies of viewing This was ingenuity, but what you can see is that in a regular buckle with indirect ophthalmoscope, nothing to take away from the indirect ophthalmoscope, but unfortunately, if a fellow has to see, there is either you have a video assisted indirect ophthalmoscope, which I have tried. The surgeon sees something else, the video shows something else on the screen, or you have a mirror on the microscope, which is extremely difficult. You have to kind of go very real near to the indirect ophthalmoscope. It becomes uncomfortable, so that's also not possible. So in this example, what can be shown by a regular indirect ophthalmoscopist assisted scleral buckle is the normal muscle tagging is very well taught. You can teach whatever is being done outside the eye, whether it's scleral sutures or tunnel, how to pass the buckle and how to tie the buckle, or even how to do the subretinal fluid drainage whenever you want to. But what is being missed? What is being missed is what are the intraocular steps that the fellow or the trainee never gets to see simultaneously. The cryopexy, the adequacy of buccal height, when to drain the fluid, how to check for the adequacy of buccal height. So these are the points which can be easily taught when you have a chandelier assisted scleral buckle. So here in chandelier assisted buckle, it's not, it has a learning curve, but for the sake of teaching, sometimes the senior faculty have to do some additional bit of effort, because you have one hand, the globe keeps moving, you have to hold with one hand. That then you can see the cryopexy, the intraocular part of the surgery very nicely. You can see the cryopexy, you can show it to the fellow, how you keep your position of the cryoprobe and what should you look for, how much cryo, where all you should do it. And also at the end of after placing your buckle, when you want to look at any decision making, whether you want to drain the fluid, is the buccal height adequate, or post drainage, what all do you look for? These are the things which generally is not possible to show with a regular indirect ophthalmoscope. So with the chandelier assisted buckle, as I had shown earlier, where to place, you can see the adequacy of buccal height here. You can also, you have to be careful about the glare. Sometimes there can be vitreous which comes out at the end of the surgery when you have to remove the chandelier, or in between you have to plug the cannula of the chandelier when you are coming back to the extraocular procedure. So these are the learnings which we have to look for, but it's an excellent teaching tool. As I said, even if you don't want to do every case like this because of various considerations, the most important being cost nowadays in practice, it is challenging. But if you can have your own 4 to 5 videos recorded in this to show or teach, or better still, when the fellow is operating and you want to see what's going on inside the eye, that's the time when this is an invaluable tool. And the fellows also learn so much more when they are operating and the senior faculty is teaching them during the intraocular steps. So with that, I will stop here. I had a very, very brief presentation, but I can take questions if there are any.
Excellent, Raja. Very brief and very to the point presentation. Raja, I have a few questions. This is one of the steps when you have actually entered into the vitreous cavity. Actually, in scleral buckling case, at the most we enter the subretinal space. If we enter the vitreous cavity, usually inadvertent. Do you recommend doing this as a routine? Suppose you're not in a teaching institute. Do you think that it offers any advantage to a, say, for example, a private practitioner or a solo practitioner doing chandelier-based assisted? Does it add to the ease of the surgery in any way, or more predictable steps?
The only consideration I have, I mean, in general, I would not say that if you have a healthy back spine, otherwise you are fit, you don't have to worry about indirect. Please go ahead and do the traditional scleral buckling. There is no problem at all. when you mention about intraocular procedure, it's not about the intraocular part. Many times we inject air, gas, intraocular saline inside the eye, scleral buckling surgery. So it's not about intraocular versus extraocular. But yes, there can be some vitreous disturbance when you are putting the chandelier, which we do in many cases. Even like Ozurdex injection, when we inject, we do get some vitreous disturbance. But overall, there have been studies which have shown that there is no, at least in our publication, it was a small series of 14 patients compared with both the 14, 14, 28 eyes. We didn't find any, let's say, endophthalmitis or, more breaks of that nature. But overall, I would say that the only time when a practitioner can still consider is if you feel that you want the comfort of the microscope viewing system and your back can be giving problems. It's a common thing in VR practice to have spinal problem. The other advantage is that your microscope, small breaks, or if you are not able to see a part clearly, this can give a better magnification. You can use the microscope zoom for looking at it in a better way. Small holes can be detected easily.
Excellent point. And do you encounter lens touch more often? Is it a concern?
No, it does not. So in fact, we have, I mean, chandeliers are placed for many other surgeries also. It does not. And whenever you are doing a kind of, let's say, SRF drainage or any other procedure, you want to check muscle in the buccal tightening at the end, you have to remove the chandelier, plug the cannula with a scleral plug, and then you do whatever manipulations you need. But even otherwise, it doesn't cause any lens touch. We have not noticed.
One more question, Raja. During SRF drainage, where do you focus actually? Do you see in the through the microscope the fundus to ensure that it is a complete drainage, or do you focus on the traditional endpoints of SRF drainage externally?
Oh, so the SRF drainage, I do normally the traditional way. That is, I see under the microscope externally. I am not doing an intraocular guided SRF drainage. I do it the traditional way, looking at the eye from the outside only. But the end point, or you want to check after that, that we use the chandelier because we have already the viewing system. We have already placed it. So the SRF drainage is done the traditional way only.
Excellent, excellent. Any of the speakers, do you want to ask any question? Do you also do the same thing?
You are on mute.
You're mute.
It's a small comment, in fact. I don't personally use it, but one of my seniors in RP Center regularly uses it. And one of the indications is when he actually wants to do a buccal but cannot identify the break. So in that scenario, if he's doing a vitrectomy, it's all right, but he wants to do a buccal, then he searches the periphery under the chandelier and microscope magnification. And that is one main indication he uses it for chandelier-assisted buckling.
So one point I wanted to ask.
Yes, sir.
Some of the cases in high myopes, the vitreous is very liquefied. And I've seen on a patient where after putting a chandelier, the whole vitreous sort of 1/4 of the vitreous came out, causing severe hypotonia intraoperatively. And then we had to re-inject BSS into the eye and then continue. That is one of the issues. And I would prefer to use valved cannulas because this prevents this loss, and preferably to use a new cannula rather than an old cannula because the valves do not work that well in old reused cannulas. So preferably use a new valved cannulas to prevent intraoperative vitreous loss, especially in patients with synthetic and synthetic vitreous, especially these high myopes or sticklers or those kind of cases. That is one.
Yeah, that's a good point, that if the vitreous is liquefied, if you are not quick enough to put the plug, then a lot of vitreous can come out, then you will have to inject saline.
I don't use it regularly, but mostly I use for patients with extensive choroidal degeneration and thinning, where because of the loss of contrast, identification of the break is very not possible. So where I'm not able to see identify the break through indirect, either on table or both on table as well as intraoperatively as well as preoperatively. Then I switch to chandelier. But otherwise, as Raja told, it's a very excellent teaching tool, especially in this era where the number of buckles is dropped drastically. And a lot of the concepts, intraoperative, these various concepts which you talk about is not easily understood by the beginners. So that way, I would say that this is a very, very excellent tool for teaching purposes.
Excellent remarks, Saravanan. Okay, we'll switch to the next topic. Very interesting when we discuss this. Vinod, he is going to tell us something on how to identify or the factors that influence the post-op results. In this presentation, he's going to talk about reducing post-operative metamorphopsia. Over to you, Vinod.
Thank you, Dr. Jati, for having me here to talk about this interesting topic, which is very dear to my heart. And this is something which I learned over a period of years. And I hope my screen is visible and I'm audible.
Yes, Vinod, loud and clear. Go ahead, please.
Lovely. So this is a patient who is there after retinal detachment surgery. And we all have encountered, most of our patients say, I cannot see doctor. And our standard response is that so? Your retina is nicely attached. So this is what I faced, and I think many of us have faced over the years. And this was exactly the condition, I would say around 7-8 years back. But and this is something which we have been commonly taught in our fellowships and residency as well. So over the years, as I learned more, so the patient started complaining that I see everything distorted, doctor. So again, my response was that, is that so? Your retina is nicely attached. Now, this was very unusual. This is something which is not commonly taught about in our teaching. So that is when I went back to literature and searched about it. So I came about this terminology called post-operative metamorphopsia. We all know that the visual results vary despite successful retinal reattachment, but metamorphopsia is a very common complaint in patients who undergo retinal detachment surgery. Now, this specifically started to happen when I came back from my fellowship from Japan, when I started using gas more and more in my cases. So this metamorphopsia is commonly vertical, and it does tend to become better over the period of time. But the patients, it can be very, very troublesome to the patients. I remember one of my patients who had, one fellow brought to me, his vision was excellent, 6/9, but the patient was very, very troubled. He had been seeing the things distorted, and we had hard time to convince that your retina was doing fine. Now, when we went to the literature, there are several risk factors which have been proposed, and where various authors have found that these factors can play a role in the causation of metamorphopsia. But we wanted to study on our own. So we did this perspective observational case study in our institute. So where we analyzed the multimodal imaging of the eyes with postoperative metamorphopsia. We took 40 cases, that is the eyes with the postoperative metamorphopsia, and 40 eyes where there was no metamorphopsia. All these surgeries were done by me. It was a primary vitrectomy where the RRDs less than PVR C1 were operated, and SF6 was the tamponade in most of these cases. We excluded clinically significant ERM in all those in the exclusion criteria, because we know that ERM is one factor which definitely leads to metamorphopsia. So we wanted to focus on the parameters other than epiretinal membrane, which can lead to metamorphopsia. And all these eyes were assessed using swept source OCT, shortwave autofluorescence, and multicolor imaging. So some of the results we found were astonishing. We found that extent of the RD, the larger the extent of the RD was, more are the chances that the eye experienced metamorphopsia. A lot of studies have said that macula on eyes tend to have lesser amount of metamorphopsia, but very few studies in our eye had macula on, so we could not comment on this particular factor. We found that eyes who had abnormal foveal contour and ellipsoid zone on OCT tended to have more risk of metamorphopsia. So these are some of the eyes which had metamorphopsia. So when we had abnormal foveal contour, cystoid macular edema, which is again a non-factor, subretinal fluid. So these are the eyes which had metamorphopsia. And we found that eyes with post-operative metamorphopsia tended to have a poorer visual outcome. So then we turned back to our literature, and we found that there are several factors which can contribute towards metamorphopsia. Now, some of the preoperative factors which affect it are age of the patient. Younger the age of the patient, more are the chances that the fluid removal will not be complete, so it will lead to metamorphopsia. A larger extent of RD and duration of the RD, longer is the duration. These are both risk factors for post-operative metamorphopsia. And the macula off status again leads to more chances of metamorphopsia. Now, most of these factors are non-modifiable, apart from the fact that we know that all the eyes should undergo, eyes with retinal detachment should undergo surgery as early as possible. Now we start shifting our focus to the parameters which on the post-operative period, which led to metamorphopsia. Now, first of these was ERM. Now we know that ERM is very common after retinal detachment surgery. So we were looking at avenues to reduce the chances of post-operative epiretinal membrane. Now ILM peeling may be one of the answers to reduce post-operative ERM. Therefore, we conducted this prospective randomized control trial to answer this question. We again included RRD eyes with PVR less than C1 undergoing primary vitrectomy. All eyes underwent 25 gauge PPV. There was no band buckle used. 360-degree lasers I prefer to use in all my eyes. And SF6 tamponade again was given to these eyes. So we included 60 eyes. In 30 eyes, ILM was peeled, while in 30 eyes, no ILM was peeled. And we assessed post-operative ERM at last follow-up. The mean follow-up was minimum of 6 months in this study. So we found that BCVA, that is best corrected visual acuity and macular thickness, were comparable in two groups. In the eyes in which no ILM was peeled, 6 eyes developed macular ERM. Now, out of these, only 1 actually required surgeries. 5 eyes had ERM, which was very subtle and did not cause any problem. However, none of the eyes in the ILM peeling group developed macular ERM. So this difference was clinically significant. But what was very striking was 6 eyes in the ILM peeling group developed an extramacular ERM. So these are the pictures to show that. So this is one of such patients who had ILM peeled, and we see that the ERM has developed, or the ILM has thickened at the area edge of the ILM peel. So now this area, we could confirm that membrane was developing on OCT also. And this again is a definitive indicator that if we would not have peeled the ERM would have developed on the macular area also. So we know that ILM is considered to be a scaffold for ERM formation. And by this study, we definitely know that ILM prevents the ERM formation. And extramacular ERM again further strengthens the ILM scaffold concept. So, but in our study, majority of these ERMs may not be clinically significant because our follow-up was shorter. But over longer follow-up period, these ERM may become thicker and may become clinically significant. So this is a study we recently published in British Journal of Ophthalmology. Now coming to post-operative metamorphopsia, some of the other parameters on OCT which can affect metamorphopsia include submacular fluid and cystoid macular edema. Now, subretinal fluid, again, we know that is more common after buckling surgery. So shifting to primary vitrectomy would reduce the chances of subretinal fluid and hence post-operative metamorphopsia. Now, regarding CME, we cannot control it, but I wanted to share this interesting case. This is one of my eyes, an elderly male who presented with macula on RD and underwent a primary vitrectomy with SF6 gas. You know, this is the post-operative macula, looks nice. Vision was 6/6, but this patient typically presented after 8 to 12 weeks or 8 weeks of surgery and had cystoid macular edema with hot disc. So something like Irvin-Gass syndrome, the OCT did show CME. And with the NSAIDs alone, this patient had a resolution of edema. So this again shows that post-operative CME is something which is not limited to cataract surgery, can happen in eyes post-vitrectomy also, thereby indicating that vitreotraction may not be the only factor responsible for this CME. Coming back to EZ, ELM, IZ status, that is ellipsoid zone, external limiting membrane. So this is something which we cannot do anything about. This, we have no control on it, but this does tend to become better. Now, this is one of my patients who underwent retinal detachment surgery back in 2016. She had post-operative vision of 6/60 and had post-operative metamorphopsia. You can see the outer retinal layers cannot be made. But the same patient presented 2 years later. She has improvement in vision. The post-operative metamorphopsia had resolved, and we can see there is resolution of the or restructuring of the outer retinal layers, leading to some amount of normalization. So that's why some of these eyes would eventually had improvement in metamorphopsia. Outer retinal folds is again something which can be seen on OCT, but you cannot do much about it. Now, coming to the last factor, this is again a very common thing seen after the retinal detachment surgery, but hardly talked about. So this is how it is seen when we were doing autofluorescence in our eyes after retinal detachment surgery. So we were astonished to find these white lines. You can see this is the retinal vein, and above it you can see a white line over here, which follows the exact course of this blood vessel. Similarly, you can see a line over here. And this is another patient. You can see this is a blood vessel. You can see a white line over here. Again, a blood vessel over it. You can see a white line. So these white lines basically represent the original site of the blood vessel. And once the retina shifts below, the RP beneath the vessels is now metabolically active, because now it is being exposed to light, while earlier it was under the blood vessel. So this is something called retinal shift, and is very common after the retinal detachment surgery. So subsequent to this, we were doing a study in our retinal detachment patients, whether PFCL should be used or we can use a posterior drainage retinotomy. So we had similar recruitment criteria as earlier and surgical techniques. We here included 26 eyes in each group, and primary outcome was to compare anatomical and functional outcomes. But we found that in these two groups, that is when we use PFCL for a drainage and when we used a posterior drainage retinotomy, the functional and anatomical outcomes were comparable. So, but what was again striking was the post-operative metamorphopsia was present in only in 1/3 of the eyes in PFCL group, while it was present in more than 2/3 eyes of drainage retinotomy group. So this was in spite of higher number of macula on RRDs in retinotomy group, which is thought to be a protective factor against post-operative metamorphopsia. So then we recently, this paper was published in Ophthalmology Retina. So how to prevent retinal shift after rhegmatogenous retinal detachment repair. Now, they've concluded that use of intraoperative PFCL does reduce the retinal shift and hence post-operative metamorphopsia, and that is what we found in our study when we compared PFCL and posterior drainage retinotomy. Now, all throughout this, I was thinking why I am the only one who is getting post-operative metamorphopsia. Does it have anything to do with the type of tamponade actually? So again, I searched the literature, and recently I came across the study where it was shown that the shift and hence the metamorphopsia is probably more common with the type of tamponade. And in their study, they found that the gas was much more commoner to cause post-operative shift rather than the oil. And they ascribed it to higher buoyancy effect of the gas on the retina. Since gas has a higher buoyancy effect, so that's why it opposes the retina acutely, while oil, because of lower buoyancy, causes more gradual putting back of the retina, and retina tends to settle back on its original pace with oil. So to conclude, so that's why, so that's how I have come out on a full circle here. Earlier, I encountered metamorphopsia once I've shifted to gas, but now I'm devising ways to reduce metamorphopsia. But the basic problem here is gas again. So to conclude, post-operative metamorphopsia is a common problem after RRD repair, especially when the gas is used. It may affect the patient satisfaction in the post-operative period, but does tend to improve over a period of time. So two of the known factors which affect metamorphopsia can be taken care of. especially if you use PFCL to drain the fluid, that will reduce the retinal shift. And if we peel the ILM intraoperatively, it can reduce the postoperative ERM formation. Thank you.
Very interesting talk, Vinod. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I have a couple of questions. Vinod, you have some cases where you can get metamorphopsia even having like without a case of retinal detachment. Do you observe any such phenomena like retinal shift or anything unusual in those cases?
It's very common otherwise, for example, in VMTs and ERMs, and especially in ERMs also, if the acute contraction has gone. I have not seen personally, but in the literature exists where there is ERM, you can see similar kind of markings on the autofluorescence because of the displacement of the retina.
Okay. My observation regarding post-op metamorphopsia is that patients who have reasonably good vision, say beyond more than better than 618, they are the ones who usually complain. If the vision is lower, say 630, usually they don't bother or they're not much complaining about metamorphopsia. What was your final visual acuity in your set of patients who actually had, and was it any different from the patients who did not have metamorphopsia?
In fact, actually, we did consider that when we were fixing our inclusion and exclusion criteria, because in this study, we took the inclusion criteria of 6/60, better than 6/60. It was the concern of some that it will be noticed only by the patients who have good visual acuity, as you mentioned. But that is not universally true. Some of the patients, even with worse visual acuity, are very troubled by this metamorphopsia. I have seen patients who had 6/36, 6/60 vision. Like I shared the images of one patient who had 6/60 but had metamorphopsia.
Okay, another couple of suggestions. I mean, I am not sure if you must have already thought about them, but any correlation with microperimetry that you have done in these cases?
Microperimetry, I haven't done anything on this aspect though, but microperimetry will give us only the sensitivity at different points. So it will be difficult to predict as to what results we are going to get and how we are going to analyze that, in fact.
Okay, and that observation in that like autofluorescence image that you have shown in the patient of retinal shift, the FAZ appeared little larger. So if you could do an OCT angiography in these cases and demonstrate the size of FAZ pre and post, would that, like, do you think there would be any correlation that FAZ would be larger if there is a retinal shift?
Yeah, in fact, we just got the study results of that PFCL versus posterior drainage retinotomy study prior to the lockdown. And once we went through the results, I wanted to call back these patients and do AF and OCTA of these patients. But unfortunately, because of lockdown, so we could not call them back. So as it slowly opens, I'm planning to launch a further study where we can study the FAZ of these patients. Even AF, you rightly noted that it is somewhat distorted as compared to the fellow eyes.
Saravanan, do you have any input, questions or comments?
Yeah, as you already pointed out, I first started noticing complaints of metamorphopsia in my patients after I shifted to primary vitrectomy with gas. So I almost use PFCL in almost 99% of my patients. I rarely do non-PFCL or regarding cases, very unusual. But in these cases, I, as you said, fresh RDs who have a 618 or more vision, those are the cases I have seen. But unfortunately, I was not able to pick up any of the changes which was described by Vinod in the OCT. I didn't see any foveal or perifoveal ERMs, but still, even the outer retinal layers were fairly normal, very minimal changes, or sometimes some of the cases did not have any changes in the outer retinal layers. I was at a loss to explain why these patients were having metamorphopsia. Even in spite of getting 6 parts or 6/9 vision, they were still having a troublesome metamorphopsia. But luckily, as you said already, these tend to improve over a period of time. One of my patients, it took almost 1 year for these symptoms to wane off. But my experience is that fresh RDs with the 618 or more vision and primary vitrectomy with gas, these are the patients that I have noticed in my practice actually.
Dr. Raja, any comments?
So, yeah, very nice observations. It's not easy to quantify metamorphopsia, although there have been publications after ERM surgery to quantify metamorphopsia or even macular hole surgery. My question is, Vinod, have you seen after, let's say, you have done retinal detachment surgery, is epiretinal membrane formation more common after oil versus gas? Have you noticed that?
Nowadays, in fact, I use oil only once there is significant PVR. So my detachment rates as well as occurrence of ERM is more common when I use oil, definitely.
Yeah, in the sense, I have noticed that one hypothesis that it tends to compartmentalize all the factors into a subsilicon oil space. So they get concentrated and there is fibrous proliferation can happen more often with silicon oil. And they tend to be much thicker whenever you do that with silicon oil. They tend to be either less often or they are much thinner when you inject gas in these patients.
But one advantage of the oil is anyways you are going in for the second surgery. So you can take care of the ERMs at that time.
Yeah, but they are very thick ERM sometimes. So it's better not to have an ERM in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hesitate to do ILM peeling nowadays, especially if I am dealing with the PVR case. I have very low threshold for peeling ILM in such eyes.
That's a good point. So, Saravanan, in your cases, when you looked at them, are you peeling now routinely ILM, and in your cases,
No,
ILM peeled or non-peeled?
I don't do it for every case. Like, it's that my choice is also only for people with the pre-existing PVR or a very immature membranes over the macula where we suspect that the early PVR is occurring. But the cases my case which had metamorphopsia were all fresh RDs cases within very early RDs with a very good postoperative visual recurring. So these patients did not have any epiretinal membranes in the postoperative period. And even the outer layer OCTs were almost normal. Most of my cases, I could not pick up any abnormality. I was at a loss to explain why these patients were complaining of metamorphopsia.
I'm sure Dr. Shukla has comments because it's a topic which she kept talking about during our fellowship days, post-operative ERMs. Dr. Shukla, please, your comments, please.
You are on mute. Please unmute.
Just a minute. Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Am I audible now?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
So only one comment. Actually, it's an addition to what Jitendra asked about microperimetry and what Saravanan said about metamorphopsia. Sometimes you are unable to explain. So we are here talking about patient complaining of metamorphopsia. I want to be objectively recorded, actually, maybe simply by Amsler's grid, if not by microperimetry, because you want to know whether there's an objective deformity. I like that picture very much, which Vinod showed, of the shift in the vessels. That's a beautiful picture. I mean, I'm really impressed with that. So we should have some objective recording of the cause. Like he said, like Sarwan said, I could not explain why patient complains of metamorphopsia. I see that my 6 patients are the one who complain most.
Exactly.
So that is one. So to separate the subjective part from the objective, we should have an objective documentation of metamorphopsia. This is for Vinod, actually.
Sir, actually, we did
Yes.
in this study where we compared the multimodal imaging of eyes with metamorphopsia versus no metamorphopsia, we actually did document with Amsler chart, and even the literature says that it is predominantly a vertical metamorphopsia, and that is what we also saw. There is something called M charts, which are available. They're a Japanese company. So unfortunately, we could not get our hands on those charts, but those are the charts which can be used for quantification of the metamorphopsia. And several studies are there in the literature who have actually quantified the metamorphopsia also.
One more reason for having metamorphopsia could be just a very chronic RD. I think in your cases, you have taken all fresh RD cases.
Yes.
So in old RDs where you have foveal atrophy by itself, by the inherent nature of the disease itself, you can have metamorphopsia.
Maybe.
I think we're running short of time. Dr. Saravanan, last but not the least, waiting for your excellent talk on sub-silicon interventions.
Okay. Jati?
Yeah, it's visible. You're audible too.
So not everybody does sub-silicon oil surgery. So there are two different schools of thought. Some people prefer to always remove the oil and deal with the pathology, underlying pathology. There are some people who think that unnecessarily removing oil, thereby incurring more surgical procedures and resultant intraoperative cost factors for the patient. So means there's no right way of doing it. Some people do like this way and other people do that way. Both are okay only. Doesn't mean that one is better over the other, but there are some areas where you would want to limit your surgical steps. So the first, when you talk about interface vitrectomy, it means that you're operating with anything other than BSS inside the eye. Aqueous, meaning it could be air where you do a vitreous base shaving. It could be a silicone oil in the eye where you're doing some procedures, or it could be you inject PFCL to stabilize the retina and do surgical procedures under the PFCL. So all this will come under a so-called interface vitrectomy, but here we'll be mainly talking about the sub-silicon oil procedures. Here I'm just showing example of interface vitrectomy under AR, where you can see that in a Regardie patient there is some leftover vitreous in the periphery, which can be which is a little bit more visible after your fluid air exchange, and then we are doing some vitrectomy to clear that off. So in these cases, the air keeps the retina stable, thereby a little bit enhancing your safety when you are dealing with the peripheral vitreous. Because in a Regardie, the mobile vitreous, mobile retina can sometimes get entrapped in your port, causing iatrogenic retinotomies. The problem is that visualizing the vitreous itself, and because the air pushes not only the retina but also the vitreous towards the retina, so it becomes quite flat, and you have to touch the vitreous rather than like in a fluid-filled eye, you just aspirate and do the surgery. Second is like this area where you're trying to peel membranes in the presence of PFCL inside the eye. The PFCL helps to stabilize the retina, and then you can do the additional procedures by doing this. So, but here mainly we're talking about sub-silicon oil procedures. So the advantage of operating when you have oil inside the eye is that by avoiding the removal of oil, you're trying to decrease your surgical time. And obviously, again, reinfusing BSS and doing fluid exchange and re-injecting oil, all those you can minimize your surgical trauma. And obviously, the cost factor is also important. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that compared to air or PFCL, the interfacial tension is a little bit less in silicone oil. So that way, the retina tends to move a little bit, not as much as it moves in BSS, but it moves more than when you're under air or PFCL. So what are the indications where you would want to do these procedures? Is like when you want to remove a post-operative epiretinal membrane, sometimes sometimes you leave some immature membranes in situ, and then it tends to become more mature, causing some amount of traction. You can go in without removing the oil after 2-3 weeks, and then remove these posterior pole as well as mid-peripheral PVR membranes. Sometimes in these cases, you may want to do some additional HA, which is not possible during the first surgery. And sometimes you leave a little bit of fluid inside the eye and it's not absorbing because of chronic sick RPs. You may want to do some additional endodrainage. And also where you want to remove some leftover PFCL. Sometimes you have eyes, beginning surgeries where they left a lot of PFCL inside the eye independently because it becomes difficult to visualize PFCL under air. So these people tend to leave PFCL. So to remove those things. And some people have the habit of using PFCL tamponade for the first 15 days, and then you want to exchange either with the oil or exchange the oil. So these are some of the indications. And other indications being that leftover subfoveal PFCL, which you want to remove to prevent postoperative visual loss. And we can also do some little bit of small relaxing retinectomies when there are PVR membranes in the mid-periphery. And also sometimes rarely due to remove accidental intraocular foreign body, which can be dropped silicone tip from the soft tip cannula, sometimes cotton fibers and other things. So what are the difficulties you're talking about here? First is unknown territory. You are always used to operating under BSS, and suddenly you ask the surgeon to do the surgery under oil. So a lot of interface, the retina doesn't move as much as you want to, or you have a little bit difficulty in identifying the residual membranes, grasping these PVR membranes, because you have multiple interfaces. You have the aqueous lens and then the oil, and then you have a small layer of superficial aqueous lying on the retina. And also when you're trying to endodrainage, usually it's most of the times you cannot do a complete drainage where the macula, where the retina becomes dry. And sometimes intraoperative laser cannot be done to the retinotomies intraoperatively when you're doing subsilicon oil procedures. So some of the difficulties we talk about here is it is because you don't have aqueous inside, cautery does not take up well, and also the blood does not tend to diffuse. It tends to get localized at the area of leak, thereby occluding or obstructing the point of bleed. So it becomes difficult to control intraoperative bleeding, and the diathermy tip should touch the retina, the retinal surface or the vessel surface to produce reaction. You cannot just do it a little bit far off, which is possible under BSS. You have to exactly touch the point. And where the bleeding point is, it becomes a little bit difficult to identify because the blood clot tends to localize there, doesn't spread out, and it tends to clump there. And you cannot raise the bottle to prevent bleeding. So you have to take out your probe and inject oil to increase the intraocular pressure. So raising the intraocular pressure with the step of your foot pedal becomes a little bit difficult. It cannot be possible by when you're doing subsilicon procedures. And also to prevent oil leakage during intraoperatively, you have to use valved cannulas also. And sometimes I believe that doing so many procedures in the oil in situ can lead to early emulsification. You are disturbing the oil so much, you are doing laser, you are doing a drainage, or doing sometimes injecting PFCL. Sometimes this can lead to too much disturbance, especially when you're using low-grade oil like in Indian-made oils. This can lead to much more earlier emulsification than you would normally observe. So how to choose your cases, like where the media is quite clear, where you have a known pathology, like this is the pathology, I want to do only these procedures. And if you are a person who are going to observe the various pathologies and identify the pathology, that may not be very well possible under oil. So when you're operating pathologies at the vitreous base area, it becomes a little bit difficult. So this is one of the post-trauma cases where there was a recurrence of RD. You can see a nasal fold where the scleral tear was there. So I thought we'll do a subclinical procedure, but you can see that extensive fibrosis of the anterior vitreous leading to a very stiff vitreous base dragging the retina. So here we, instead of going for a silicone oil subsilicon procedure, we have to remove the oil so that we can identify the effect of your retinectomy, the various tractional forces. So we are doing so many large retinectomies in the periphery. It's not ideal procedure to do subsilicon procedures. So these cases, because the bleeding is also difficult to control, it's better to remove the oil, and you'll have a better way of assessing the mobility of the retina, the stiffness of the retina, the areas you want to cut. So where you're planning for extensive procedures, don't go for subsilicon procedures. In subsilicon procedures, you don't usually need the third port. So usually the first superior 2 ports is enough to deal with these. Just keep oil ready. So a lot of times a little bit of oil leaking out from these ports will cause obscuring of a media. So always put visco in your cornea. And if there is media is not clear, always make the media clear by removing the epithelium or increasing the pupil size. So do all these things because already you're operating under a little bit decreased visibility because of the multiple interfaces. So make your media as clear as possible. So I told you that superior 2 ports is enough to operate on these cases. Third port is usually not necessary. So you can inject additional oil intraoperatively to any of these 2 ports. So always, as I told you, keep oil ready when you start your case so that when there is intraoperative bleeding, you have it ready to increase the pressure when you have bleeding inside the eye. So first step to do is to first go to the disc and remove this small layer of aqueous which is there. So this also enables to see the visibility surface membranes much more clearly. As I told you, what happens is there's a small secluded area of aqueous just on the retina between the oil and the retinal surface. And without removing this, you'll have a lot of disturbance. So what you do is you put your soft tip or your hard tip cannula there and aspirate it and then go ahead with your surgical procedures. This will help you to remove at least one of the interfaces, thereby increasing your visibility. This is one of the cases where we have done endo drainage intraoperatively and doing some laser. So during doing posterior laser is not that very difficult when the oil is inside. So it's quite easy. But when you move to the extreme periphery, because of the leftover parts of the hyaloid and the vitreous base area, it causes a lot of interface reflections. So it may be a little bit difficult to do laser in the extreme periphery. So we done a small, luckily in this case, I was able to drain the fluid intraoperatively totally. And this is the area where I had removed a PVR, which was causing the break to open up. And you can see here, you can see the residual vitreous, and doing laser to the extreme periphery becomes a little bit difficult. So this is what I was saying about when you're trying to address membranes in the vitreous base area, this hyaloid can create multiple interfaces, causing difficulty in visualization, both during laser as well as in the peeling membranes. So in these cases, if you're not very confident about visualizing these membranes, don't hesitate to remove the oil and then go ahead with the more conventional technique. Again, you can see the multiple interfaces in play during the laser procedure. Again, if you're trying to cut some membranes or vitreous, the vitrectomy probe does not function as well as you would want to do it under BSS. So you have to keep your suction at the maximum. In concentration is about 650 millimeters of mercury. So keep it at your maximum and use core mode. We have the options of shifting to core mode, 50-50 as well as shave mode. Don't use the shave mode when you're operating on oil because it's a very, very slow motion cutting. So and always try to feed the tissue into your mouth because the oil does not move in so smoothly. So feed the tissue just push the tissue into the cutter mouth and then start cutting. So using cutter is not that very easy under silicone oil. It becomes very, very slow and takes a longer time to remove tissue. Sometimes you may use your forceps to remove tissues rather than cut them. It becomes very difficult to use the cutter under oil. So also you can use PFCL also inside the during the subsequent procedure, but it's not easy to do it. So what you do is you always make the pressure less by removing some of the oil, create a hypotony, and then you can inject your PFCL. Sometimes the PFCL causes sticky bubble syndrome when oil is inside. So removing the PFCL may be a little bit difficult than compared to routine surgery. So you have to be aware of that. Sometimes the silicone oil sticks to the PFCL, making it a little bit difficult to remove it intraoperatively. But otherwise, normally we prefer not to use PFCL with silicone oil, but you can use it to assess traction forces or push the fluid to the periphery to drain through pre-existing retinotomy rather than making additional retinotomy. I'm just showing a few cases. This is a case of ROP who had developed stage 4R, which was operated earlier when she was a kid, but she developed RD when she was around 13 years old. And it was a very bad RD, and we had to put oil. And because of hypotony, we could not remove the oil. She had 624 vision, which dropped after this development of this epiretinal membrane. Here again, I didn't want to remove the oil. As you can see, I'm using a pick to remove these PBR membranes there over the macula. So again, we are doing a 2-port vitrectomy. So you can see that there is a small aqueous pocket there. Thereby, it sort of makes the plane a little bit difficult doing the surgery. So you may have to be aware. So you can remove the this small aqueous layer before or during a procedures. And again, we tried to limit the membrane peeling to only critical areas. Trying to peel all the membranes may cause additional retinotomies, as well as it may induce more inflammation, thereby causing reproliferation postoperatively. Try to limit your surgical steps to the least. So this again a case of submacular PFCL which was addressed in the immediate postoperative period. This is a video provided by Dr. Naresh from Madurai. You can see a large bubble of PFCL in the posterior pole. So again, because it's the immediate post-op, we don't want to remove the oil here. So removing the PFCL very, very early helps to prevent permanent photoreceptor damage. So try to address this problem as early as possible. So in small retinotomies need not be lasered, but if you want, if it looks big, you can laser. But ideally, small retinotomies can be left unlasered in the posterior pole. This is one more case where we had a smaller bubble. Larger bubbles can be directly aspirated because the retinotomy will occur outside the macula. But when you have a very small bubble, it lies exactly under the fovea, and you don't want to create unnecessary macular hole in those cases. You can use a 40 gauge needle, but here I'm using, because I didn't have the availability of 40 gauge needle, I'm using a 30 gauge needle, which is hooked on to my 24 gauge intramuscular needle. So you can connect this to either to a silicone injector, which is filled with BSS, or you can connect it to your syringe, 1cc syringe, which the nurse can inject while you're operating. So here again, you can see there's only a 2-port vitrectomy. One of the ports doesn't have a cannula because I'm inserting a bent system here. So you have to make the bend so that the plane is flat at the level of the RP, at the level of the flat to the RP at the level of the macula. You should not hit the RP when you're trying to insert it subretinally. And ask the nurse to slowly inject the BSS, and you create a small bulb of a bulle of RD there. And then using a soft tip, you mobilize the subfoveal PFCL towards the center of the bulle. And once that is accomplished, you can try to aspirate the submacular fluid from the earlier retinotomy. And this will remove both the SRF as well as the subfoveal PFCL along with the, when you suck it, both will come out. So thereby emptying this. And as I told you, some of the unusual cases is when you drop soft tip cannula the tip is accidentally comes off during your surgical procedure. This is again provided by Dr. Naresh. Accidentally, there was a cotton thread which was lying in the post-repol notice on the first post-operative day. So they are trying to remove it from the retinal surface. Again, no big deal. Just make 2 ports and then catch hold of the foreign body, whichever is there, and then you can remove it. This is one unusual case where the cannula had gone inside. Again, as you can see here, that's the 23 gauge cannula which is lying inside the retina. So these are some of the unusual cases where you have to deal, but otherwise these are very rare and very often you don't see these complications. So you just have to using a handshake technique to remove like a foreign body. You have to extend the scleroderma a little bit to remove this. I think I'll stop here and I can take questions, Jyoti. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, VRS, again for an excellent talk and as usual, excellent videos and covering the topic very comprehensively. VRS, one question I have, I think whenever I have tried to do some subsilicon surgeries, the most notorious is the bleed, and it's very difficult even with like it consumes some time to take oil and then inject. It's not immediate. We want to control the bleed immediately, especially if it is going into the subretinal space. And of these bleeds, most notorious is the choroidal bleed, which even like it's very difficult to control even with endocautery. So how do you prevent or how do you tackle these bleeds if in case you have to do subsilicon surgeries?
So one is the first point, wherever you expect a large bleed, like you're planning to do extensive retinectomies or you're operating some proliferative diabetic retinopathy cases where there's a pre-existing NVE or NVD, where you expect large, you're previously expecting that there's going to be significant bleeding intraoperatively, better not do the subsequent procedures. So in case you have accidental bleed, as I told you, always keep your oil ready for injection. So once you notice a bleed, immediately take out your main port and either your protector or forceps, whichever you're using, and immediately inject oil, make the disc pale so that the bleed intraocular pressure rises and the bleed stops. So sometimes I inject a little bit of BSS with a syringe onto the fovea to lyse this blood and aspirate it. But when there is a significant bleed, I always abandon the subsequent procedure, remove the oil, and then go in for a routine surgery. Choroidal bleeds, again, it's not possible to stop under subsiliconal procedure, so you have to remove the oil. And I usually keep the cautery at 100% of the capacity and then try to cauterize. But again, it becomes a little bit, it's impossible to deal under oil. So these cases where you expect, don't take it up. And in case it bleeds, always keep your silicone oil injector ready. If it goes beyond this, be ready to remove the oil and deal with it.
Okay, we have a habit or whatever, the compulsion to reuse instruments at times.
Okay.
So do you think that using equipment like cutter or laser probe actually makes the instrument less durable, or you're not able to use it for as many cases if you use it under oil?
I'm not sure about that. Whether using under oil decreases the life of the cutter, possible. I don't know. I've not done. I've not seen and observed what happens to these cutters or light pipes. But possible. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay, many people do laser under oil. I think whenever I was at Arvind, and we used to see that the equipment could not be used. After a few times, the laser probe just would not work because there's protein coagulation happening at the tip, or maybe the overheating of the tip under oil because it's an insulator. One more question: have you used BBG under oil to stain ILM? Many cases of ERM, very commonly we need to stain and remove ILM to prevent recurrence of ERM. So
I have not used BBG, but what I have done ILM peeling without staining also, because of the interface. Usually, once you lift the ILM, it becomes much more visible. Like unlike BSS, under oil as well as under PFCL, the ILM is visibility becomes much more. So a lot of times, most of the times, you can remove the ILM without using BPG. So whenever I use PFCL or oil to subsequent, I never use dye. So both under PFCL, under oil, I don't use dye to identify the ILM. I use it only when I'm doing under BSS.
Right. Vinod has a question. I think I can see from his smile that he has a comment and a question.
I don't very commonly do sub-silicon oil surgeries, but when I do, I make 3 ports rather than 2 ports. And to the infusion port, I usually connect automated silicon oil injector. So that is in handy. Just in case bleed happens, you can press your foot switch and that takes care usually. So that is the only modification I do differently. So it is like any other 3-port vitrectomy.
And I like to bring Ashray here. There was one question in the chat box from the audience. They've asked that how much pressure do you raise while doing, say, combined mechanism RD in case there is a bleed, if you encounter a bleeding? Ashray?
Usually, in most bleeds, 60 mm of mercury is enough. But if it doesn't stop, you can go up to 80 as well. But very rarely, if you identify the plane and do the vitrectomy, you rarely have such intractable bleeding. But up to 80 mm of mercury also, you can go to arrest the bleeding.
Yathi, can I add to that question answer?
Yes, please.
So this three things you need to observe when you're deciding this bottle light. One is the mistake in the system. So when you're using cassettes, especially, what you set in the screen may not be delivered to the eye. So it may be much less. So always look at the disc and assess the pressure. Sometimes if we keep 60 or 80, the delivered pressure may not be 60, it may be much less. And look at the disc to get an assumption, make an assessment whether the pressure is really going up. When you see pulsation and pallor, that means your bottle height is really going up. That's the first point. So sometimes make sure that what you set may not be always delivered. So keep that in mind. Second is when the intraocular blood pressure of the patient is high. Sometimes you notice that the blood pressure really goes up because the patient is tense. When the intraocular pressure goes up, your normal tamponade pressure does not work. You may have to go beyond 80 also some of these cases, especially if you don't have anesthetists to take care of the intraoperative rise in blood pressure. So if you have an anesthetist, you can ask them to give medication intravenously to decrease the blood pressure. But if that is not the case and you don't have the option of decreasing the blood pressure and you have a bleed, it's not stopping by conventional pressures, you may have to go as high as till the blood bleeding stops. So keep these two in mind. One is the mistake in the system, and second is the intraoperative patient's blood pressure. So these two may decide the tamponade pressure which you want to keep intraoperative.
I just want to highlight one more publication in this matter. There's Japanese authors who have published on hyperinfusion vitrectomy. So hyperinfusion vitrectomy means to raise the bottle height till you stop the bleeding and then allow that primary plug or the clot to form. And they kept it for say around 3 to 5 minutes time, and they observed that the results when they were doing hyperinfusion vitrectomy improved as compared to the earliest cases where they were not using this technique. The postoperative results, actually anatomical and functional results, both improved. But there's a word of caution. A lot of these patients have compromised microcirculation. So you cannot stretch it beyond a certain point, and that call has to be taken individually, seeing the complexity of the disease, systemic as well as the local disease. Many of these patients have very severely 360-degree occluded vessels. In those cases, actually, you should not stretch it too far. Dr. Shukla, your comments, please.
You are muted, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So one is, as Sarvan correctly pointed out, sometimes the objective parameters don't work. You think your pressure is 80 and the pressure is being delivered as 60. So I prefer to look at the disc for pulsations. So that is part one. I don't look at 60, 80. Yeah, the tamponade is on at 60, but I do not hesitate to take it to 100, say. Because the simple thing is you can occlude the disc vessels. You can create a central lateral artery occlusion for a short time if that is what you want to see. So you can have a short, so if you are inducing disc pulsation, you are absolutely safe. So if you are looking at disc pulsation, till the pulsation stop, you can increase the pressure rather than looking at the objective parameter. That is about the IOP part. Second thing about the re-surgery under oil, what Saravanan beautifully showed, I want to warn everybody, the surgeon, Saravanan is a very accomplished surgeon actually. He's a very good surgeon, and don't try to copy him actually. This technique was started by Steve Charles. And Steve Charles has excellent silicone oil. Now, Saravanan actually has done an embarrassing mistake. He's saying that Indian silicone oils are cheap. So we are using Orosil actually, which is our parent company. But the thing is, all these oils emulsify very quickly. So I don't see the point of retaining the Indian oil inside the eye. I prefer to remove it, release the membranes and inject it again, because first, these oils are cheap. And second thing is because they are not completely filtered like the Alcon oil, for example. So Steve Charles can do a vitrectomy and his oil does not emulsify in 6 years. But our oil emulsifies badly within 3 months. So that's my reservation for oil surgery under oil.
Rightly pointed out. I think I put up this point in my slide also. So by doing excessive maneuvers in our kind of oil, you are bound to shorten the time. I don't want to put any names. Jati, I think your mic is muted.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. First of all, to accept being the faculty for this webinar, and then spending your valuable time making the presentations and sharing your valuable piece of work, and most like taking your time off during this webinar beyond the scheduled time. And thank you so much. I would like to thank Intas who have taken all the precautions and necessary steps for the smooth functioning of the webinar and for sponsoring the event. And thank you all. I'd like to thank Raja in his absence. He had to leave for another meeting. Thank you, Vinod. Thank you, Dr. Shukla. Thank you, Ashray. Thank you, Dr. Salman. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye to all. Good night. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night, sir. Good night, sir.